February 12, 1943, Murmansk, Soviet Union. A gray dawn crept across the Arctic port, dim light bending through clouds heavy with snow. The harbor groaned under ice, cranes creaking like old bones. Soviet sentries stamped their boots to stay warm, their rifles slung carelessly, not out of laziness, but disbelief. Out on the frozen docks, something was coming, something none of them had ever imagined. The first sound was a low rumble, far out in the bay. Then came the silhouettes, massive Liberty ships, steel hulls gliding through broken ice like moving fortresses. The Red Navy tugboats whistled as they guided the convoy into port, the latest Allied Arctic convoy, codenamed JW-53, bringing supplies under the Lend-Lease program. The men on the docks had heard about American aid before, trucks, food, weapons, but what they were about to see went far beyond rumor. As the gangways dropped, Soviet stevedores braced themselves. From the holds came not just crates, but entire locomotives, carefully dismantled and crated, ready to rebuild Russia's shattered railways. Beside them, endless rows of olive-drab boxes marked "Property of the U.S. Army" carried trucks, jeeps, rations, radios, and even prefabricated bridges. The air smelled of oil, cold steel, and possibility. Private Alexei Petrov, a wiry 20-year-old from Smolensk, stood frozen as he watched an American officer step off the gangway, tall, clean-shaven, with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Name's Captain Harris," the man said through an interpreter, smiling faintly despite the bitter wind. Behind him, sailors shouted orders in English as cranes began swinging cargo into waiting Soviet trains. "You boys ready to move some freight?" Harris asked. Alexei just stared. Freight? The Americans had brought an empire's worth. Hours passed, but the unloading never seemed to end. Food tins, tires, medicine, boots, even entire field kitchens, all packed with military precision. Soviet quartermasters moved like ants, struggling to find space for it all. One lieutenant, rubbing his eyes, muttered, "We could feed a division for a year with what's in one of these ships." He wasn't exaggerating. Then came the sound that made every man on the dock stop what he was doing, the deep metallic clang of coupling steel. The first American supply train, assembled from flat cars and boxcars shipped from Alaska and Scotland, was being loaded. Its sheer length stretched beyond sight, disappearing into the swirling snow. A murmur rose among the Soviets, astonishment, then laughter, then disbelief. Alexei climbed a small embankment to count the cars, gave up after 50, and shook his head. "It's not a train," he said quietly. "It's a moving city." Captain Harris joined him, glancing down the endless line of freight cars. "In the States," he said through the interpreter, "this is nothing. We call this a medium load." The interpreter hesitated, unsure he translated correctly. Alexei's eyes widened. "Medium?" he repeated. Harris smiled, adjusting his cap. "We've got longer ones back home. They run all day and all night." For the Soviet soldiers, raised in a world where shortages defined life, the sheer abundance felt surreal. Each trainload carried not just supplies but the idea of a different kind of war, one fought with industry instead of bodies, with logistics instead of sacrifice. They could scarcely believe that one nation could produce so much, send it across half the planet, and still have more to spare. As night fell, the train's engines fired up, great black beasts spewing white steam into the freezing air. Floodlights turned the snow to silver. Soviet and American crews stood side by side, watching as the first convoy of freight cars began its journey south toward the front lines. The steel wheels groaned, sparks flew, and the ground trembled under the weight of Allied power. Alexei watched until the last car vanished into darkness. "If this is what their trains look like," he murmured, "then maybe we can really win this war." He didn't know it yet, but those trains, and thousands more like them, would become the unseen lifeline of the Eastern Front, fueling the Red Army's push toward Berlin. The next morning, the convoy's iron giants rolled steadily eastward, plowing through the frozen wilderness like a moving wall of steel. The rhythmic clank of wheels against track echoed across the tundra, a heartbeat of progress in a land long starved of motion. Along the snow-dusted rails, villagers gathered, peasants, children, wounded soldiers, staring in awe as endless lines of American-made Studebakers, Sherman tanks, and fuel drums passed like a river of machinery. Inside one of the lead cars, Private Alexei Petrov sat beside a Soviet rail engineer named Sergei Volkov, both wrapped in thick blankets. The train car creaked under the weight of ammunition crates stamped U.S. Army, property of War Department. Alexei ran his hand across the stenciled letters, tracing them like something sacred. They send this much, he said, and still fight their own war? Sergei chuckled, lighting a cigarette. Comrade, the Americans build like they breathe, without stopping. The truth wasn't far off. By 1943, U.S. industry had become an unstoppable machine. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago turned out trucks and tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. While the Red Army bled on the steppes, America's industrial arsenal fueled the fight from afar. The Soviet soldiers traveling aboard these supply trains were witnessing the physical embodiment of that power, steel proof that their distant allies meant business. As the train thundered through Karelia, snow fell thicker. Each car's coupler groaned, and somewhere in the middle of the line, a soldier began singing an old Russian marching tune. The melody carried through the cold air, blending with the hiss of steam and the grind of the rails. For a moment, the soldiers forgot their hunger, their exhaustion, their grief. They watched the horizon blur past, trees, frozen rivers, villages burned to ash, and for the first time in months, felt hope flicker. That night, they stopped near Petrozavodsk, where a Soviet quartermaster unit waited to inspect the cargo. Dozens of officers walked the length of the train, their flashlights cutting through the fog. Captain Harris stood beside them, clipboard in hand, checking off each crate. "You'll find more spare parts in the next shipment," he said through the interpreter. "Engines, belts, tires, whatever keeps them moving." Major Ivanov, a stocky officer with frostbitten cheeks, nodded in disbelief. "In our army," he said quietly, "we rebuild tanks from scrap. You Americans send new ones." Harris gave a small smile. "We build them faster than you can break them," he replied. The major didn't laugh, but deep down, he knew Harris wasn't boasting. By morning, the men of the Red Army began unloading the cars, their gloved hands stiff from the cold. Each wooden crate, each barrel, each spare tire represented something beyond material aid. It was trust, cast in metal and shipped across a hostile ocean. The Americans called it logistics. The Soviets called it survival. Further down the line, Alexei helped unload a half-track vehicle, its olive paint gleaming under pale sunlight. He brushed a layer of snow off the hood and read the words painted on the side. "From the people of the United States, to our allies in the USSR." He smiled, shaking his head. "They even send us jokes," he muttered. But there was no joke in what these trains meant. Within weeks, those same vehicles would be tearing through mud and snow near Leningrad and Kursk, carrying food, shells, and the wounded. Soviet generals would soon credit American transport for keeping divisions supplied through the darkest winters. As the final cars emptied, Captain Harris climbed aboard one of the locomotives, waving farewell. "More coming next month," he called out. "Bigger trains. Maybe you'll believe us then." The Soviet men laughed, half in jest, half in wonder. They could barely imagine. Bigger. When the steam whistle blew, the sound rolled across the white landscape like thunder. Alexei watched the departing train until it vanished into the fog, a symbol of an ally that fought with engines and factories instead of bayonets. For him, and for countless others, that train was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a glimpse into a world where abundance, not desperation, decided the fate of nations. He would later tell his comrades, "We fight with courage. They fight with steel. Together, maybe that's enough." The Soviet soldiers who marveled at the endless trains rarely saw how those supplies reached them, the brutal, frozen sea lanes of the Arctic convoys, where men fought not against armies, but against nature itself. March 1943, Barents Sea. A gale screamed across the North Atlantic, waves taller than houses crashing against the bows of Allied ships. The convoy, codenamed JW-54B, was underway, its deck crews lashed by freezing spray as they guarded cargo bound for Murmansk. Beneath the surface lurked German U-boats, waiting in the black depths. Above the clouds, Luftwaffe bombers circled like vultures. On the American freighter SS Ballot, Chief Engineer William Hartman gripped the rail as a wave smashed across the deck, nearly sweeping a sailor overboard. "Hold fast!" he roared. The ship groaned, the engine thundering deep below. In the cargo hold, the same crates Alexei Petrov would later unload in the USSR lay stacked and secured, thousands of tons of fuel, food, and vehicles. Each crate represented a gamble, a wager made in steel and courage. Convoy duty was among the most dangerous assignments of the war. Temperatures plunged below -30°C, ice coated the rigging, and visibility often dropped to near zero. The men slept in damp clothes, ate frozen bread, and prayed the next torpedo would miss. The sea claimed many who tried. Between 1941 and 1945, over 85 Allied ships were sunk along the Arctic route, and more than 3,000 sailors were lost to the frigid waters. Yet the convoys kept coming. Every ship that reached Soviet ports meant another train leaving Murmansk, another division fed or armed, another battle sustained. Stalin himself once admitted privately that without the Arctic convoys, we would have been defeated. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, planners argued over priorities. Many questioned why so much effort was poured into helping an ally that might not survive. But Roosevelt and Churchill agreed, defeating Hitler required keeping the Eastern Front alive. The industrial power of America could not sit idle while millions fought and died in Europe's East. In late 1943, to protect the convoys, the Allies began deploying escort carriers, destroyers, and long-range bombers to hunt German U-boats. The U-boat captains, once hunters, became prey. The tide turned, and more ships reached their destinations. When Alexei's second train arrived that summer, he noticed something new. A small plaque bolted onto one of the locomotives. "Arctic Convoy Survivor, built in the USA." He ran his fingers over the frozen metal, imagining the men who had risked their lives to bring it here. "Some never made it," said a Soviet officer beside him. "They say the sea ate them whole." Alexei nodded, silent. The train's engine hissed softly, almost like a sigh. He thought about those men, sailors from Boston, Liverpool, Halifax, who would never see the land they fought for. And yet, through their sacrifice, the Red Army rolled forward. The supplies they delivered became part of Soviet strength: bullets and rifles, fuel in tanks, bread in soldiers' packs. When the first American-built Sherman tanks arrived at the front near Kursk, Soviet crews stared in disbelief. The tanks had radios, padded seats, and heaters. "Luxury," one gunner muttered. But they worked, and they helped blunt the German assault. The same Studebakers that arrived on Alexei's train soon carried Katyusha rocket launchers, roaring across the steppes in thunderous waves of fire. The partnership wasn't perfect. Mistrust and politics always loomed, but the steel connection between factories in Detroit and soldiers in Stalingrad could not be denied. The Arctic convoys, and the endless trains that followed, had built a bridge between two worlds. Alexei often wondered if the Americans knew what their gifts had become, if they understood that each crate and car they shipped was a piece of the front itself. To him, the trains were more than supplies. They were a promise kept, paid for with sweat, fear, and the frozen dead of the Northern Sea. That night, as another convoy steamed into Murmansk under the northern lights, Soviet searchlights swept across the ice, welcoming them home. The colors danced across the water: red, blue, and white, shimmering like silent flags. Somewhere deep inside, Alexei knew this was how empires were saved, not by words, but by iron, courage, and the will to deliver. By the spring of 1944, the American supply trains had become a familiar sight across the Soviet Union, yet their scale and consistency never failed to inspire awe. In every town, from Archangels to Moscow, people would gather along the rail lines just to watch them thunder by. They carried more than steel and machinery. They carried the weight of an alliance forged by necessity, and the promise of victory that still seemed distant on the blood-soaked fields of Europe. At Chelyabinsk, a rail hub deep in the Urals known as Tankograd, Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to assemble tanks using parts from both sides of the Atlantic. American steel blended with Soviet armor, creating machines that bore the marks of two worlds, stamped with Cyrillic letters and American serial numbers. Nearby, women in factory uniforms painted slogans onto the hulls. "To Berlin!" and "For Roosevelt and Stalin!" The irony was not lost on anyone. Two nations so different, now united by shared survival. Alexei Petrov, now transferred to a supply regiment, had become one of the countless men responsible for escorting these supply trains from station to station. He knew every sound they made, the grind of couplers, the shriek of brakes, the low thunder of loaded cars straining uphill. He also knew what those sounds meant. Each whistle in the night was a whisper of hope to soldiers freezing at the front, a signal that food, fuel, and ammunition were still coming. But behind every shipment lay a silent question: how long could this steel bridge hold? There were still losses. Convoys were attacked, depots bombed, trains derailed by German saboteurs. Once, Alexei's train came under Luftwaffe attack near Vologda. Stuka sirens screamed overhead as the crews scattered for cover. Explosions tore open freight cars, sending crates flying into the snow. Alexei crawled to the wreckage and found one of the boxes split open. Inside were chocolate bars, medical bandages, and a note. "Good luck from New York." He stuffed the note in his coat and never spoke of it again. By late 1944, victory was in sight. The Red Army had crossed into Poland, and the Western Allies were fighting their way through France. Still, the trains kept running, longer, heavier, and faster than ever. The Soviet railways, rebuilt with American parts, now pulsed with life 24 hours a day. It was said that if a man stood along the Moscow-Murmansk line long enough, he would see a supply train every 30 minutes. Captain Harris returned briefly that winter, older now, with silver showing in his hair. He met Alexei at a depot near Moscow. "You still counting cars?" Harris asked with a grin. Alexei laughed. "I stopped when I realized it doesn't end." The American nodded. "That's the idea." They stood together for a moment, watching the endless procession of freight cars roll by: food, fuel, ammunition, clothing, and hope. Harris turned to Alexei and said quietly, "Back home, they don't see this. They just see numbers on paper. But this," he gestured toward the tracks, where sparks flew under the wheels, "this is what wins wars." Alexei nodded. "And what saves men." When the war finally ended in 1945, the world changed, but the memory of those trains never faded. The Soviet soldiers who had once stared in disbelief carried those images with them for life. Endless lines of American freight, steaming through snow, loaded with everything they need to survive and fight back. For many, it was their first glimpse of abundance, of a world not defined by scarcity but by capacity. Years later, as Alexei sat by his fireplace in a rebuilt Smolensk, he would tell his grandchildren stories of those days. Not of battles or generals, but of the trains, the roaring beasts of iron that came from across the sea. "They were not just machines," he would say. "They were bridges of steel and trust." And somewhere, in an archive or a forgotten photograph, the image remained: Soviet soldiers standing beside American locomotives, steam rising around them, eyes wide with wonder. For all their differences, in that moment two worlds met on the same track, one powered by courage, the other by industry, and together they changed the course of history.